Okay, so welcome. I am familiar with some of you, but for those of you who don't know me, my name is Sophie. I am a mother. I have a 4-year-old daughter. I'm a single mom. I am also a motherhood studies sociologist. And whenever I say that at first, obviously because it's my identity that I have taken on, I am really familiar with what I mean, but I'm very well aware that that is something which not necessarily a common job title. So to explain a little bit about what being a motherhood studies sociologist means is I liken it to thinking about a scientist in their lab who goes in with their lab coat and they have their specimens that they're examining under their microscope, and they're curious about finding things out about the things they're examining and making connections and posing hypotheses and seeing what the results are from their experiments. And a social scientist is somebody who, our lab is our social world. Our lab is our environment. And what we're studying are people. So we're studying people and relationships and groups and communities of people. And what we use as our microscope or our lens through which to do that study are different theories, different conceptual tools, different methodologies. So that's basically, in a nutshell, what I do when it comes to motherhood. I'm really curious about the ways that we individually experience motherhood and how our individual experiences actually connect together into a broader picture of what it means to be a mother. So the purpose of this call is to share with you what has actually been adapted from my PhD research findings. So I spoke to mothers of children with disabilities, mothers of disabled children, depending on our terminology. And what I was interested in was actually their experience of motherhood, because so often when you look at the literature and you look at the research, and it's not just in the arena of disability, it's actually when looking at all sorts of different experiences of the mother and the maternal, we're so often interested in the mother because she impacts children. So let's be really interested about the mother's experience because we know that it will impact her children and her family and her broader community. And what I was really interested in was saying, well, what about the mother's experience in and of herself? What about considering her as an individual, her own lived experience, her own perspectives, not just because she's instructive and because how she feels may be instrumental for another, but because she is worthy and valuable of study and interest and focus in and of herself. And so part of what came out of my research findings was this broader conception of motherhood as an ideology. So I started to see patterns in what was being shared, and I went to the literature and I looked and found that similar patterns existed for mothers in all sorts of different socioeconomic locations, in all sorts of different social roles. But actually for mothers who had children with disabilities or additional needs, a lot of the time they experience an intensified version of the pressures and shoulds that exist more broadly in motherhood. So the major finding that came out of my research was looking at motherhood as a system, understanding that it has a system, it has a structure, it has a focus, and we can't actually see the individual mother in isolation without understanding that she's located within this bigger picture. So the terminology I originally came up with in my research was called hegemonic maternality, which is super jargony and I know not understandable or relatable at all. So I've shifted that, and I now don't work in the academic space. I run my own business. I have a podcast. I do online courses. And in the process actually of explaining and describing this theory of how motherhood is social and what does that actually mean, in a talk I was giving, I kind of came up with this analogy, which has really worked well to be able to describe this. And this analogy is what I'm going to be sharing with you here as a model for understanding how motherhood is social. The first thing I want to say is to make 3 distinctions here when talking about mothers and motherhood. And these distinctions are important because language is important. And sometimes, a lot of the time, I think we actually get confused and we switch between talking about mothers or mothering or motherhood when they actually mean different things. So mother, we can frame mother as an identity, mother as a role, mother as something that we step into or we take on as a label for the individual. We can then think about mothering as a practice. So think about mothering as a verb. It's something that you do. It's something that is done. It's a skill. It's a labor. It's a discipline. And I'll mention a little bit further on here, but mothering is also connected to a particular type of thinking. And that can be developed whether you are a mother or not, actually. There's some debate and contention around that as to, how broad can we take the term mothering? But mothering, think of it as a doing. An interesting comparison as a side note there is to think about the language of fathering and the differences in what we mean when someone says, I'm mothering her, to I'm fathering her, and the connections, the differences, right? Fathering we tie to some sort of genetic or biological function, whereas mothering, we understand it's related to care work. And then the third distinction here, there's mother, mothering, and motherhood. And this is the main part that I focus on in my work and that I'm trying to bring attention to. And motherhood is the social and cultural structure. That is the broader system that we live within. So an individual mother does her mothering within a broader system of motherhood. So when we become a mother, we go through a whole bunch of changes. And a lot of the time, those changes can feel like a shock, can't they? It can feel like we're all of a sudden in this whole new realm and this whole new world. And sometimes we ask the question of, why did no one tell me about this? Why couldn't I prepare for this? Why is this such a shock to my system and understanding of what's happened in my life? And I remember having this sense even when my daughter was first born, and when I had the little co-sleeper attached to the bed and thought, yep, she's going to sleep in there. And every time I'd pop her in there, she'd cry. And so I have to pick her up and put her back in, and she'd cry. And I'm thinking, what's happening here? This isn't how it's supposed to be. And I ended up just staying up all night with her in her nursery. And I saw the sun come up and I thought, this is motherhood? What's happening here? I don't know what I'm doing. And mind you, this was after I'd completed my PhD in motherhood. And that's something I'm often asked, is how does understanding the social and cultural stuff of motherhood prepare you or not into being a mother? And that's where I like to go back to making those distinctions, to say you can understand the social and cultural stuff that's different to the actual practice of caregiving and maternal thinking. So motherhood is bigger than us. It's bigger than us as individual mothers. And when we go through these changes and shifts into the role and the identity of mother, we go through a whole bunch of other changes as well. They might be relational changes. They might be changes in how you relate to your work or your career, changes in how people see you, changes in how you see yourself, changes in your interests. Right? We go through changes in so many parts of our lives, but a change that we also go through that isn't often talked about or understood is we enter into a social realm. So when we become a mother and we are within that identity and others perceive us and see us as mothers, that comes attached to it particular expectations, particular understandings around what it means to be a mother. And you could think about this almost as a rule book for motherhood, right? We say that we have no textbook on how to do this, but there is actually a rule book on how to be a good mother. And I'm going to go through some of the rules that are part of this, and I would really encourage you to reflect on this for yourself as well. But the pervasive and powerful nature of these rules is that they apply to all of us. But oftentimes, we don't have the rule book in front of us. We don't know that we're actually living against and according to these rules. And this is part of our socialization. And this is what the model I'm about to share with you will help explain. So we go through this rule book, and there are certain things that are written on there, right? Around just think in your head, perfect mother, who is she? What does she look like? What does she do? Well, for a start, she's probably white, right? Because patriarchal motherhood is based on colonialism. It's based on white supremacy. It's based on ableism. It expects that the perfect mother will be white, able-bodied, middle-class, neurotypical, likely married, heterosexual, 2.5 kids. She engages in some form of paid work because she's not reliant on anyone else for income, yet her children always comes first. She cooks, she cleans, she takes care of the domestic realm, she takes on the emotional labor, not only of her children, but of her partner, of her friends, family, and community. She was made for motherhood. It comes naturally to her. She doesn't get angry. She does not lose her temper. She's not irritated by her kids. She never regrets motherhood. She never longs for pre-motherhood life. She has endless patience. She self-cares excellently. She cooks organic and from scratch. You know, I could spend the whole of this talk talking about the different constraints that are part of perfect motherhood. But you get the picture, right? You get the idea that there are particular expectations that are placed on us around what it means to be a good mother. And the powerful part of this is that if we don't fit in somewhere, so if we don't fit into the rule book of perfect motherhood, say, for example, we're a single mother, and so we don't fit into that nuclear family normative model of what family means, we can feel like we have to try and make up for it in another area. So I'm going to work really hard to self-sacrifice so my kid never goes without. You know, I'm going to work really hard to try and fit myself within that box of normality in some way, even though I know I'm actually blocked out of it. And so this inevitably, I think, you know, it's clear to say that this is a myth, right? There is no one who actually lives up to all of these rules because it's not possible to. And some of the rules actually conflict with each other. So you can fit within one and you're actually not fitting within another. And so part of what happens is that we end up feeling individually inadequate. We end up feeling like we individually are failing somewhere because we're not enough in some form. And we're exhausted, we're overwhelmed, we're overburdened, and we think that we just need to try harder, we just need to do more, we just need to be better in some way. And so where has this rule book come from? How have these rules been maintained? How have we come to internalize these rules or not? And how can we start to break them? And so this is where the model of the fish tank of motherhood comes in to help explain this. So I'm going to screen share with you and show you a graphic that I have here. So imagine, this is my obviously very sophisticated graphic design skills. You have the fish tank here, right? So think about this as a round glass tank. You have the water inside the tank and you have the fish. So think about this fish tank as our society. That's our context. That's our structure. That's the world that we live within. And the thing about the world that we live within in our context is that it's usually invisible. This is why it's a glass tank. We look around outside of ourselves and there's nothing tangible that we can grab onto. It's the world in which we live. So that, in this analogy, that's the motherhood. That's the structure. That's the system of motherhood. Inside the tank, we have the fish. Okay, here specifically in relation to motherhood, we're talking about the fish as the mothers, but every individual in society is the fish. So in the same way, not in the same way, but the process by which we are socialized into the tank, into what motherhood means and the ideals of motherhood, others who are not mothers are similarly socialized in this way. And this can be why we face pressures from others, high expectations from others. And it can also be why those who are not mothers, women who cannot or choose not to have children, can be stigmatized and feel a sense of othering because they don't fit within this model of woman equals mother. So think about the fish as the individual mother. What is written underneath of these major headings are some of the theories that I go through in the Motherhood Studies Practitioner certification, but I flagged them here just to say that there's a lot more to dive into if we want to keep running with the water analogy for each of these. And the maternal self in motion is a way of thinking about identity and motherhood. We then have the swimming. This is the practice of mothering. This is the doing of your mothering work. And this is where I mentioned earlier the perfect mother myth. We can talk here about intensive mothering ideology. This is a theory by Sharon Hayes in her book, The Cultural Contradictions of Motherhood. And it's quite a dated book now from the 90s, but you could read it today and it would be just as relevant as ever. And part of what that talks about is the intense pressures that are placed upon us in our practice of mothering. And this is where things like anger and guilt come in, the mental load, emotional labor, and the doing work of caring. You then have the water, which is our socialization. So this is, think of it it's like the air that we're breathing in. It's what we're immersed within. It's a drinking in of those rules. I explain this in certification as a pyramid of maternal regulation. And so it starts off when we're children ourselves. It starts off with, the good girl, the good child concept, the ways that we are expected to be compliant and nice little girls and polite and certainly not angry, certainly not disobedient. And we are socialized into a particular idea of what it means to be a girl or a boy, right? So this is part of our gendered socialization. If we think about it in this way, right, all the pressures and the rules of motherhood that we're experiencing as mothers, or that those who you are supporting are experiencing, it started way, way, way before we became mothers ourselves, right? It starts when we're children ourselves. This part of the socialization is also being placed into these binaries, into these boxes, right, of you're this mother or you're that. Ultimately, it's you're the good mother or you're the bad mother. And we rely on the bad mother stereotype and imagery to exist in our culture, because if we didn't have the bad mother, we'd have nothing to compare the good mother to. So if we didn't have this division and this breaking of you don't fit and you do, we wouldn't have a standard by which to measure how well someone is able to fit into this ideology of perfect motherhood, this institution structure of motherhood. So this gives you a bit of a visual and a bit of understanding to think about the ways that we are immersed within a structure of motherhood. And sometimes I like to use the visual of looking around the tank and actually seeing the rules written on there. So on the glass, with a big black Sharpie, someone has written all those rules up there of what it means to be a perfect mother. And something that I often ask mums to do, or those who are wanting to support mothers to do, is to actually write down the sentence, a perfect mother is, or a good mother is, and challenge yourself to write down all of the expectations and all of the attributes that you have attached to what it means to be a mother. Now, this is not to say that all of those attributes and things that we've attached to motherhood is wrong or bad, or they need to be changed. It's about noticing the attachment of those particular attributes with mother, because within that list, when we write that list down, there will be our values in there. There will be things that are actually really important to us in our individual lives as mothers, but there will also be a lot of shoulds. They'll also be the result of our socialization. And so when we're swimming around in this tank, part of what happens, and I go into this in greater detail in the course, I've called it here the gazing guard tower of maternal power. It's based on a model called the panopticon, if anyone wants to look that up. But it's to explain how power operates to keep us within that tank. Because here's the thing, right? If enough of us in this tank, in our society, were to start saying, actually, don't really like those rules that are written on the wall of the tank there, don't really work for me, actually contribute to marginalization, oppression, and the fracturing off of pieces of myself, right? Because in order to fit according to someone else's idealized image of what it means to be a mother, we actually have to lock away and cut away pieces of ourselves in order to try and fit that model, which we never will quite fit into it. But if enough of us were to come together, and this is a big motivation in why I'm doing this talk and why I do the work that I do, is that if we can have language, understanding, and connection with each other as to how we're socialized, how we experience this socialization, how we, as uncomfortable as it may be, how we participate in the perpetuation of this socialization, The more of us that are able to do this, and we're able to come together collectively, because this is not an individual pursuit, the more we can come together collectively, we can collectivize our power, we can start to create incremental changes. I think about this as creating cracks in the tank. About ramming the tank is a line we have with motherhood studies practitioners, right? So how do we ram that tank? So this is to say, as long as we remain divided as mothers, as women, as feminists, as people who are passionate about making social and cultural change in this area, if we are remaining divided in any way, which this produces through the good, bad mother binary and other mechanisms, it means we can't effectively collectivize and come together to create change. As a kind of a little asterisk here, which I can't go into in greater depth, but to really explicitly say that the challenging of this system is connected with fundamentally the challenging of broader systems of oppression and marginalization. So what can happen, as a side note here, right? Think about the visual of these little fish on the screen, ramming that tank and making some changes. What can happen is that other fish that are looking at that fish ramming the tank can all of a sudden become really threatened. Because not everybody knows that we're in this tank. Not everybody understands socialization, nor should they, right? It's designed so that we don't fully understand it until we start to dive into this learning in a deeper way. But when other people see us do things differently, when they see us challenge the normative models of what it means to be a family, when they see us challenging the way that gender is expected to be performed, when they see us challenging the myth of self-sacrifice, when they see us challenging that actually we don't have to be these perfect martyr mothers, however that challenge may look, that can actually feel really destabilizing for others. Because while we're ramming the tank trying to create change, we're also creating ripples in that water. We're also creating movement. And to some, that movement can be uncomfortable. It can be disruptive. And for some, that movement can actually be dangerous in some ways, right? So this is why we need to have an understanding of socioeconomics. We need to have an understanding of how these fish inside this tank, they face different barriers according to where in the tank they are. It's ultimately a conversation about privilege and marginalization and intersectionality, but to understand that there are consequences and challenges involved in doing this work as mothers ourselves, as people who support mothers. There are challenges that are part of this, but there are also challenges in not doing so, right? And I think that actually the unseen costs of not engaging in the challenging of the system in the way that it is, that the costs are too high for us to carry, right? That we know the costs on the mental health of mothers. We have research that looks at the extent to which a mother has individually internalized intensive mothering. So she's taken on these shoulds as part of her belief system, and that's the way she judges herself as a mother. The higher that is, the higher is her likelihood of experiencing depression, anxiety, low well-being, low life satisfaction. And the anger guilt trap is a concept down here I've mentioned under the practice of mothering. It's a way that keeps us trapped within this system, right? And we take it on our shoulders as if it's our fault. All right, I'm going to stop sharing that now on the screen, and I will email out a copy of that to you. So I'm coming back to my notes. What else do I want to say here about the tank is the structure? I want to mention here Adrienne Rich's work, her book Of Woman Born. And this was where really it was the first distinction that had been made between the structure, the tank, and the individual experience of mothers and motherhood. And she has a quote here, and she says, "We do not think of the power stolen from us and the power withheld from us in the name of the institution of motherhood." The institution of motherhood is the tank of motherhood. And she says that we experience this oppression, marginalization, based on the potential relationship of any woman to her powers of reproduction and to children. So in other words, when this institution, this tank exists in the way that it doesn't just affect those who identify as mothers. It also affects anybody who has been socialized into the role of being a woman. It affects our children. It also affects men, right? I think that there is a misunderstanding that patriarchy is this division between the sexes, which, again, like, this is trying not to go down this rabbit hole because I tend to make these trainings longer than I intended them to be. But to really say that the implications of the patriarchal institution of motherhood reach far beyond us as mothers. In saying that, though, I think it's important that we are able to claim space without it needing to be for the purpose of anyone else. So sometimes I think we can be in this space of going, I need to do this work, or I want to do this exploration to support myself so that I can better support others. True, right? I think we all know the realities of this, and the whole analogy of you can't, you can't pour from an empty cup, all of that. I go into a deconstruction of that analogy in one of my recent podcasts, if anyone wants to have a scroll and have a look. Yes, we know all of that, but also our purpose is not just in our utility, right? We're not just interested in supporting mothers to have more freedom, more fulfillment, a better life, better well-being, just because she'll therefore be able to serve other people better. No, let's break out of this model, right? And this is leading me on to talking about, well, what does an alternative look like? What does the dismantling of this tank look like? In one of the last rounds of the certification, we had a Q&A Zoom call with Professor Andrea O'Reilly. And Professor O'Reilly coined the term motherhood studies in about 2008. There's a whole bunch of literature and a whole history of maternal scholarship in the discipline of motherhood studies that just hadn't been named. And motherhood studies gives that maternal scholarship a home. And one of the questions that we asked Professor O'Reilly was, in her experience, she's been doing this work for 3 decades, has published prolifically on motherhood and researched it her whole career. Does she think we're in a motherhood revolution? Does she think that we'll be able to actually see the results of this change in our lifetimes? And part of the conversation that we had around that got to a place where she doesn't think we are in a motherhood revolution yet. And we probably won't see the results of this on a broader structural level in our lifetime, maybe in our children's lifetime. It's not to say we can't make significant changes, and we can certainly make changes in the lives of the women we support and in our own lives. But to know that actually this work is bigger than us, and that this is part of what we're doing for the future generations of mothers. This is part of the legacy that we leave in the work that we're doing. I'll also send through via email in Professor O'Reilly's latest version of her book, Matricentric Feminism, which is mother-centered feminism. She describes the 10, what does she call them? The 10 dictates of normative motherhood. And I'll send them through via email, but it's almost like a checklist, if you will, to go through all of the ways that our socialization operates and all of the expectations that are attached to the motherhood role. So talked about the structure, I've talked about the fish, the water, our socialization, the swimming, our practice. One other thing I wanted to say about the swimming, the practice of mothering, is that concept I flagged earlier, maternal thinking. This is a concept that was developed by Professor Sarah Ruddick, and it describes the thinking work that mothers do. Have a look at her book, Maternal Thinking, what's it called? A Politics of Peace. Google it and you'll see the full title. But the last half of her book, she actually talks about maternal thinking in the context of peace. And there's been a whole like world peace and anti-militarism. It's really interesting for anyone who wants to explore that further. But this concept of maternal thinking is the thinking that we develop in the process of caregiving of children. And she says that there are 3 main imperatives attached to maternal thinking: preservative love, author's name for, I've just seen that, Jess, Maternal Thinking, Sarah Ruddick, S-A-R-A Ruddick, yeah. So there's preservative love, the nurturance to foster their growth, and the training, which is socialization. So we love our children, right? We care for them, we support them, we foster their growth. So we kind of adapt our mothering practice to that little individual person that we are nurturing. but we also support them in their own socialization, right? To become functioning members of our society, to have a sense of belonging. And the thing that's really interesting to explore here, and this is what is leading me to talking about our power as mothers, is that training, that socialization, that's also where the socialization of patriarchal motherhood starts, right? So as mothers, we also have opportunity, and as those passionate about supporting mothers and those caring for children, we have the opportunity to start to disrupt and interrupt and break these cycles and patterns of the pressures of perfect motherhood right from the beginning in how our children are socialized. And I talk more about that in the certification in the context of feminist mothering. So why is understanding the fish tank of motherhood important? Because I believe, and you may disagree, right? None of these are absolute truths, but I'm here because I believe that we cannot adequately support a mother in a way that creates sustained and long-term change in her embodied and lived experience unless we can also see and understand the water that she's swimming in, the tank that she's living within, and to create sustainable and broad sweeping change that we need for mothers. We need to be able to change this tank. We at least need to be able to call it out, right? We need to be able to name the things that we want to try and change. And it is really hard to shift systems and things and practices and ways of being that we haven't been able to acknowledge, that we haven't been able to talk about and name. So our power as mothers, as professionals, as people who are interested and passionate in doing more learning in this space, is that we can actually elevate and deepen and enrich the support we're able to offer the individual fish, the individual mother, when we understand the broader system that she lives within. Also, just a note there, that tank that I showed you earlier, and the way that it's constructed, that's also based on historical time period and geographical context, cultural context. So that tank now in 2021, it looks really different to the tank that our mothers or grandmothers or great-grandmothers were living within. And this can also be why there can be a disjuncture generationally between mothers, because we've been socialized in different looking tanks. So moving on to the end here, I'm almost done. My vision and purpose here is to name the tank that we're in, to be able to understand the social construction of motherhood in its current form, to dive into the often uncomfortable and challenging work of how we've internalized these broader structures and systems and how we will also have contributed in sustaining them for others. And how we can start to understand that discomfort actually opens way to opportunity. We can then, when we start to do our own process of detoxing in a way from this socialization that we go through, which by the way is an ongoing process. I don't think we're ever done with that. But once we start to go through that, it opens opportunity for being able to start seeing and thinking about the power of our maternal practice, the power of naming these structures and institutions to give language to what it is that so many mothers are experiencing, but they feel like it's all on them. They feel like it's their fault. They feel like it's their responsibility, right? We're not talking about individualistic models here. We're talking about social and cultural ones. And this is why I created my course, the certification. I originally, when I did my PhD, I thought, oh, I'll go into academia after this, and hopefully that will work flexibly with, wanting to become a mother myself. And, my landscape of my individual context and life changed. The broader landscape also changed in the academic world and space. And what I realized is that actually there is so much literature and so much research and so much that has been done in this space that has not been taken out to the public more broadly, that has not been taken to mothers themselves for us to think about how we can use these concepts to enrich our own lives and create new meaning for ourselves and what it means to be a mother. And so I believe that we are key change agents. And when I say we, I'm very much recognizing my position as both a mother and a professional in this space, I tend to not separate the two very much. And I think that actually we can gain a lot of power from bringing in our lived experiences into the type of work we do, depending obviously on what type of work you do. But I think that we miss a lot of the story if we only focus on the individual mother. And integrating these broader understandings opens way to creating a new path, because the opposite to the perfect mother myth, the opposite to this tank that's constructed, I would like to say, is not a tank at all. We just jump, like it would be a great narrative to finish with. We jump out of the tank and we, use our power to make sure we don't live within systems anymore. But that's not how society and culture works. That's not how power and hierarchy works. And we actually do need systems to live within. So what I want us to be able to do, and what I want to be able to cultivate in terms of community of people who are passionate about this work, is for us to find ways to create cracks for changes, is to find ways to disrupt systems, is to find ways to create new meanings. And for mothers to be able to reclaim a motherhood of their own. It's not some other version that they're going to grab onto and replace instead of the perfect mother myth. It comes from here and moves outwards, right? And that's harder. That's harder to do than grabbing onto an ideology and pulling it in close. But I think that even though it is harder and more challenging, I think it's ultimately more rewarding, more transformative, and more sustainable as a way of thinking about empowering and empowerment in motherhood. So the certification, it's 10 weeks long. We start on the 20th of September. It is a culmination of 10 years of study and research in this area that I engage in an ongoing capacity. And it's my way of trying to make these understandings, these concepts, this research and this theory relatable, understandable, and translatable for those of you who are working in the space of motherhood support, or you would one day like to. So we have 8 modules of material. Some who have joined the certification are completely new to this area. They're just interested and think it may lead to something in the future. Others have been in this arena for decades. And we've got psychotherapists, nurses, midwives, coaches, authors, students, psychologists, OTs. And it's really amazing actually being able to connect with people from different disciplines and backgrounds and seeing the connections that we can make through our work. And so we have 2 Zoom calls a week. I definitely do not do as much talking as I've done on this Zoom call here. You have pre-recorded lectures that you dive into throughout the week, about an hour-ish, an hour and a half-ish, broken up into little chunks, because I know many of us who do this work are mothers ourselves. We don't have huge, big chunks of time. And then we sit on and we come into community, right? It's a creation of community and of connections between each other in this space. There's 6 months access to all of the course content, so the pressure is taken off of getting through all of it and keeping up pace over the 10 weeks. And you get a logo, an emblem at the end, a certificate after you complete an assessment, which is not as daunting as it sounds. And there are also study circles that I'm introducing in this round, and a new module, which basically takes all of the modules of teaching content and turns them into guides and worksheets that you can do and that you can implement into your work with mothers. So I'm about to ask if there are any questions, but as I finish off here, I also have a mastermind called the Mastermind for Motherhood Visionaries. And this is a really intimate group and a space for those who have been certified as motherhood studies practitioners to be able to come into for support, for coaching. We go into these think tank calls, which if anyone wants to borrow this concept, they're really fun and interesting as a way to, every person brings to the call an idea, a problem, a creation, and gets group feedback on it. So that's there as an option too for those of you who are interested, if you would like to join after you come into the certification. So that is it for my talk. If you'd like to learn more about the certification, we start September 20th, as I said, and I will pop a link in the email replay, but it's drsophiebrock.com/motherhood studies. And I will wrap up the training here Thank you for those who have been watching on the replay. Feel free to message me with any thoughts, reflections you may have, or any questions, of course. And thank you for being here. Thank you for creating the time to engage in this type of content, in this type of thinking and reflection. I really appreciate and value your time and commitment.